Hello, my little code gremlins. Welcome to my free course on YouTube here, the Complete Express Server Development course. I'm Luke, your guide on this journey to becoming proficient in creating a robust and scalable Express server for your applications. A little about me, I'm a professional programmer. I've been coding for the last 5, almost 6 years. I'm clearly a YouTube educator and content creator, and I'm a huge MERN stack enthusiast. You probably, if you have any experience on our YouTube channel, you've seen me building various applications and having fun doing so. As well as answering tons of student questions, trying to make a series on conquering the JavaScript interview. I'm just in it for the love of the game, to share everything I know and I've learned, and I also help myself from learning from y'all as I do so. So, like I was saying, I love TypeScript, JavaScript, React, Node, Express, MySQL, and most recently PostgreSQL, something I'll be including for the first time in my series in this video. I really enjoy teaching and sharing my knowledge with y'all. And I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to do so in this course as well. So whether you're just a beginner starting out or an experienced developer looking to solidify what you already know, then this is the course for you. Our focus here will be taking a blank directory and gradually building a central Express server that can serve as the backbone of any of your projects. You can choose to use this server in a coupled fashion, or you could choose to use it in a decoupled fashion, or you can kind of build it into a mini CMS. This is something that I have done in various iterations in my career so far, where I like to have one Express server running and deployed that can quickly add routes for any new client project I'm building. I build a lot of goofy and fun little CRUD applications for my students to see for these YouTube playlists and eventually full courses I have. And I also like to build like little widgets for myself, whether I'm tracking stuff at the gym for my friend and I, making a little recipe card application for my wife, building a plant watering tracking device. A lot of these things are CRUD style applications that can quickly be built up by simply adding a new table, as well as some quick queries for your backend. And rather than having to choose a new backend every time, which does have its merits and can be kind of fun, just using like a Google Excel sheet or a Google Sheet that's converted to a REST API, sticking to MySQL only and things like that. I think it's really fun. It's nice to not have to recode a fresh server every single time I intend to deploy a new client-side project. So we're going to cover a range of topics here that this little presentation will show you all before we get to coding, including setting up development applications you're going to need, the technology we're going to be learning, and the concepts we're going to be going with. So I really can't wait to share this journey with you. So we're going to jump right into this presentation to cover some of the basics before we begin coding. So yeah, coding a server to support other projects. There are some pros and cons to this concept. Let's take a look. So we're going to be coding one Express server to rule them all. And you might be wondering, why bother just coding one to serve all of our projects? It is nice in that we can centralize all of our logic. We can have a lot of common functionalities such as authentication, data validation, logging, error handling, external API integrations. All this stuff will be nice to have in one central server. Resource efficiency. I mean, a lot of the times, like I was saying, some of my projects include adding 1 or 2 tables to a database and then inserting some data and then reading that data to visualize it on the app. That's all it is. So having a single server reduces all that consumption as compared to running multiple servers for each project. Again, like I learned how to build a coupled project from Covalence here, as I'm an alumni myself, and eventually I began building decoupled projects, and eventually I was like, why do I keep coding the same server over and over and over again when I can have one that will simply add all these things for me? And it also will simplify development. Managing a single Express server simplifies that deployment process. Development? I said deployment, didn't I? I said development. I meant deployment. So managing a single server is very easy to deploy. You only need to deploy and maintain one server instead of multiple instances, which we're still going to be using anyway with PM2 once we get in there. But in the darkness we shall bind them. So what are the downsides? I don't know what the title has to do with downsides, but I had to continue the Lord of the Rings theme anyway. So yeah, there's going to be some downsides to this. As in with all coding, I tell my students it's all about pros and cons, trade-offs. You're going to be cashing a check that eventually your butt's going to have to cash. So we're going to have some increased complexity. Clearly, having a singular server is going to induce complexity as the code base grows larger and larger and larger and larger, and we have to determine how we're going to organize all these things via folders, export statements as modules, and index files and all that kind of fun stuff. Then you're going to have some scalability issues, obviously. If the client-side projects all have vastly different scaling requirements or performance demands, a singular Express server might struggle to handle the varying workloads efficiently, meaning, for the way way I'm coding this is like, again, it's like a personal server for all of my goofy little side projects, meaning I'm probably not going to have scalability issues, but I might have some issues where one of my websites or my client apps might have some kind of WebSocket requirement that would make me code a whole bunch of extra stuff on my server that nothing else would use. And in that case, I may be like, well, I might go code my own individual server for that project with its own WebSockets coded onto it, since nothing else on my server would need that. On my mega server, it might need that. So, there are scalability issues when you begin to code that. But again, this is not meant for huge production apps that then you're going to have like 10 different clients on. But again, this is a great foundational idea of how to build one of those, right? So we're going to have some good fundamental building blocks built in place. So yeah, scalability issues aside, we have code maintenance. Trying to have a singular Express server means that changes to one client project could potentially have some really big impact on others if you're not careful, as well as all the versioning control and all that collaborative process with Git we'll run into as well, going, hey, how do we release this thing in versions that make sense, that don't crash the other client projects when we adjust one right here. So again, because we're focusing on a backbone for our personal portfolio projects that may not be super robust or have tons of users. Again, it might be just the recruiter or interviewer looking at your side project that you want to have a nice server to handle. So yeah, I mean, these are all clear downsides, but their impact is not as large as you would think, given that we are just coding this as a backbone for our little side projects. So in terms of tech, we're going to use TypeScript. We're going to be using TypeScript because if I want to be writing any kind of JavaScript code, I want to have some type checking as well, and I get to show y'all some cool tricks along the way with that. Ultimately, if you don't know TypeScript, check out the YouTube series I have called TypeScript Tips. I release at least almost a video a week about common tips that I wish I had learned when I first started out in TypeScript. If you're interested in learning the full thing, then we have a course for it in Covalence, check the description down below. I'll be using Node.js, and I don't know what the current LTS is. I'll probably install it after this video here, which I should have done beforehand and mentioned, but nevertheless, just go install the long-term support version of Node.js, which will come with NPM as well. We're going to be using Express.js to build up our REST API. I don't want to have to write a bunch of low-level functions for starting up an HTTP server, adding middleware, and things like that. So I'll use Express. It's big, it's popular, it gets the job done, and it doesn't have too many things in a row we're going to have to code about. Now, 99 times out of 100, I tend to include MySQL as the database of choice, as that's what we teach here at Covalence, and a lot of these tutorials are meant for my students to try and follow along with. And again, it's widely popular and very Googleable to search for help with. But I'm going to change it up for this tutorial and include Postgres, something a bit more modern feeling. I haven't really used it outside of a simple like Hello World style project in the past, so I have reinstalled Postgres as well as pgadmin 4, which is the GUI that they include in Postgres. For those of you that are students from our full stack development course, pgadmin 4 would be the equivalent of like your MySQL Workbench or your Beekeeper applications, right? For those of you that are not familiar with Postgres, I would recommend you probably have some SQL knowledge when we get here. So, and no RM either. I'm not a fan of ORMs. Like, I understand their use, and I appreciate the fact that they can really speed things up out of the box, but I feel like I get a better learning experience by trying to write crap myself, which is going to be the goal of this one as well. So no RM. I'm probably going to regret that one later, but it is what it is, right? And we're going to be doing some stateless authentication with JWTs. So a lot of the times I will typically include, that's redundant. A lot of the times I will include Passport.js as a module for, or a middleware for Express that allows us to handle authentication. But honestly, I never really use stateful or session-based authentication authorization strategies, so I really don't utilize a lot of what Passport can involve for me. I do have like other series here on YouTube, so check out like our channel and search for like just Express, and you'll find other tutorials where I do like just JavaScript or add Passport to it or whatnot. But this one I'm going to write everything myself, since it doesn't need to be all that crazy, right? So moving on, some applications I'll be using in this series that you should probably also have some simple knowledge in or pre-installed to follow along. I'll be using VS Code as my code editor of choice. It just has a lot of extensions and useful things and provides a great environment just to code in general. Some familiarity with shell is going to be important. I'll be using Commander here on Windows. You're welcome to use the built-in terminal on your Mac or Linux devices. If you're on Linux, you probably don't need to be told what a shell is. If you're on a Mac. You can find your terminal by going into your Finder and just finding the keyword terminal. Newer Mac OSs will use something called Z Shell or Zish, ZSH sometimes. Older ones using a traditional bash. It doesn't really matter as long as you have a shell. There are newer options on Windows that I regretfully haven't explored much yet, but I'll be using Commander. It is a simple drag and drop application onto your directory somewhere, onto your hard drive somewhere, and all you got to do is open the Commander executable, and you're welcome. And it will emulate all your typical shells commands that you will see me using and that you can natively run on a Mac or Linux machine. I'll be using Git for version control as well as GitHub for hosting this repository. I'll have this project being pushed via commits to a repository on GitHub, so y'all can always clone and follow along to the best of your abilities. Granted, some of like the environment variables and passwords and things like that will differ, but that is what it is. I'll also be using, like I mentioned in the previous slide, Node.js and NPM. It's how we're going to be coding a server runtime environment for JavaScript and TypeScript, and NPM is the package manager that will use that. Postgres, like I mentioned in the previous one, it's a tech use. It's also going to be what we're installing. Literally right before this this slide I made, I installed Postgres v15. This is the latest installer from the Postgres website, and then it also installs pgadmin 4, and I'll be using that as my GUI to write out some writing out some Postgres SQL scripts. And then I'll also have install and use Postman, which is a popular API development and testing tool that lets us make HTTP requests and look at their responses, which is basically all our server is going to do, so we should probably have a tool to run that with. So yeah, some final thoughts here. I'm only a human being. Again, this is not to hedge like negative comments or anything like that, but I want y'all to know that I've been coding for 5 to 6 years now. I still learn new things every single day while I'm coding, while I'm reading, while I'm helping students in our Discord, answering YouTube comments, both positive and negative. I learn new things every single day, and I make mistakes like everyone else. So while the patterns I'm going to be implementing and the choices I'm going to make in this project are based on what I've learned to date and my own personal preferences. They're not definitive, meaning I will probably change my mind 2 months after making this course and looking back at this project and going, man, I could have done that so much better. I think that's just kind of like a not stigma, but like it's a indicator that I'm still learning and progressing just like y'all. So I want to hopefully help raise y'all on my shoulders as I figure out new things as well. So remember, our goal is to create a solid and simple scalable server that facilitates quick development of client-side projects for building out our portfolios. That's going to be the goal here. And big thing to remember, technology and best practices evolve, mine own as well. And we should embrace the opportunity to continuously learn and improve. So again, this is not some definitive be-all, end-all, but rather something that I want to share my current knowledge with y'all and learn from y'all as well. So yeah, with some of that stuff out of the way, let's exit out this project. I used beautiful.ai to make these slides here. The first time I got to goof with something like that as well, which I thought was pretty dang fun. So yeah, we're going to close that out. That little slides there. Oop. Tons of video. You can see I had tons of takes of videos there. I'm not going to open that again. But that was just like, you'll see like tons of like 10-second video takes right there of me trying to make various videos. So I'm going to open up my shell, aka Commander, and this is where we're going to go ahead and get started. I have a Covalence folder. Surprise, surprise. I'm going to cd into a directory I have called Helping Students. This is where obviously during my webinars, whether I'm in Discord or Zoom showing students how to do stuff, I will just make all my folder projects here to help them out, including for my YouTube series. So let's go ahead and make ourselves a new folder, and we're going to call it, I should have thought of a name. We're going to call this Express Backbone. Yeah, that sounds good. It's called the Express Backbone. I like how I had to come up with that on the fly right here in this video. We're going to cd into that project as well. And like I said, we have a blank directory. This is something I like to do occasionally to make sure I still know my stuff and to give y'all, and again, like not to like just glaze over 15 JSON files that all of a sudden populate the root of a project and not going over what they do. So this will be a lot of quick information, but not a lot of fun coding as of yet. So we need to create this as a npm or node project. And normally I do the -y flag. I should have not. So if someone already hit Y, it's okay. You can just go fill in your package JSON. But we'll actually answer some of these questions here by converting this into a node project, running our npm init command. Package name, Express Backbone, sounds good to me. Definitely version 1.0. Description, a central Express server for all our portfolio needs. Entry point will eventually be a it'll be an app.ts file eventually. So we're going to go ahead and go with that right there. I don't have a test command at the moment, so I'll just write echo. Yeah, whatever, let's write echo. Git repository, we haven't made one yet, so I probably should have git initted it and then done this step here first, but it is what it is. Keywords, Express, TypeScript, PostgreSQL. All right, that's what we got going on here. Author, we're going to say Cool Hand Luke, which is my name in our Discord channel. I'll stick with the ISE license for now, and I'll pick one later, probably ISE or MIT, whatever. That seems fine to me, and we're good to go right there. I will go ahead and write git init as well to get that up and running. So we now have it initialized, and I haven't yet created it on GitHub, which again, I'll make sure to link in the description down below. And I'm debating on doing this via branches for each video, or again, it wouldn't be good coding practice to have each ending video be a new commit, but that is an easy way to see like where one video ends, and you can go look at that commit to see what I coded during that video if you want. Like, if you don't want to see like the end of the project and try and find where I'm at in a video that might be in the middle of the series, you can always go find that commit. And I'll try and remember to, in the description of the video, to add the commit in the description so you can always go look at it directly rather than having to go through my commit history. Right. So we need to, what do I want to start with here? I want to start with installing a couple of packages. So clearly we're going to be using TypeScript here. So I'll go ahead and install TypeScript as a development dependency. Now, again, like you don't really need to put everything in dev dependencies. Like you'll see some people argue just cram it all in dependencies. Some people like it separated between dependencies and dev dependencies. During deployment, that could be an issue where dev dependencies are sometimes removed after the installation process. So you have to make sure that you understand whatever you end up deploying. I think we're going to choose render since I'm using Postgres for this particular video series. That you have to understand the build process and when those dev dependencies might be pruned out in deployment. But locally, it doesn't really matter. This will just be for our benefits. I'll also be installing TS Node and TS Node Dev. These are going to be our packages for quickly developing our Express application without having to do constant recompiling or messing with NodeMon and things like that, so it shouldn't be too difficult to get into. Right, TS Node just builds itself on top of TS Node Dev builds itself on top of TS Node, a quick way of just quickly transpiling our code without having to recompile it every single time. Yeah. And clearly, we're going to need the typings for Node to make sure that our TypeScript compiler can help us, and IntelliSense and VS Code can help us autocomplete with the correct types of Node, as well as make sure we don't have any problems during the compiling process of our code. And we'll also be installing the typings for, I mean, it would make sense if we're going to install Express here in just a minute. We might as well go ahead and do that while we are here. There are going to be some other things I'm going to install, but I'll talk about them in a minute. So for now, let's just go ahead and install those things right in front of us, and I'm going to go ahead and open my code editor to take a look at what we got going on. This lovely project. Let me zoom on in. Sorry, everything's super zoomed out. I should have prepared this beforehand, just so y'all could, yeah, there we go, just so y'all can see what's going on. But again, this is like, you know, me developing on my own time where everything is super zoomed out. I don't have to zoom in so much like I do for these tutorials. But yeah, we got our dev dependencies installed and good to go. Let's go ahead and install our singular dependency for now, which will be an npm I of Express. And we'll talk about rate limiting and validating. I'm looking at like my notes to make sure I don't miss anything important yet. And we got a lot to cover, so this is going to be a fun, long course on YouTube. All right. Heading back to our code editor, we have the main dependencies installed. You know, normally dev dependencies is listed below dependencies, so this is not important in any shape, way, or form. I want you to know this. What I just did is in no shape, way, or form like syntactically important. I am just a creature of habit at the end of the day. I'm gonna leave. I'll probably regret it. Stop. But I'm going to go ahead and leave autosave on, and I'll probably regret that in the long run. Okay, so we got that up and running, as in like installed, and we have our node modules good to go. While we are here, we need to include a .gitignore. The gitignore file allows us to tell Git things to ignore. For example, it needs to ignore our node modules directory and eventually a .env file, and probably a build directory when we actually compile our code. We normally don't push compiled code to GitHub. You totally can if you wanted to, if that was your deployment strategy, to compile locally, push it to GitHub, and when you deploy it, have it read the build folder. But I'm going to choose to build it wherever we end up deploying it. So again, this is a very simple git ignore that doesn't need to be any more complex than this. But I do have one I tend to copy and paste in between projects. So I want you to know, like, these are like the simplest and most core things you would probably want to include in your git ignore to make sure that it is looking good. But there are other things that end up getting generated, so I'm about to copy and paste a whole bunch of Garbo right here. Again, I mentioned this in other series I have on YouTube here at the Covalence channel, that this is just one I commonly copy and paste between projects because it just kind of covers a lot of common bases and things like that. So if you're wondering, hey Luke, how am I going to pause the video and get all this? Don't worry about it. Just head to the repository in the description linked down below and copy and paste my git ignore into yours so you can quickly do so as well. Or just quickly Google a solid git ignore that covers a lot of bases, or a general git ignore for your projects and things like that. But this is a pretty solid one that, again, I just copy and paste in between my projects. But again, the three things were env, a build directory, right? Env, a build directory, as well as node modules as well, to make sure it's not being out there. So yeah. Anyway, that's a solid git ignore to make sure that we're not pushing things up to GitHub by mistake that we shouldn't be, in particular our env file. At the end of the day, that's one of the more important ones we don't want to screw up. From here, we need to configure some things for TypeScript so we can have some additional help going on. So, where did my notes for this go to make sure I'm not missing something? Yeah, let's make a new file. We're going to call it tsconfig.json. This is something you can generally automatically create with TSC, but I'm going to choose to write it out by hand just so I can discuss the things we're looking at here. JSON, JavaScript object notation, will be a set of curly braces. We're going to be including, in double quotes, our options. Now, because our VS Code editor IntelliSense is coded with TypeScript in mind, it can go ahead and help us begin auto-completing some of these properties. So we can see compiler options will be something we're going to include right there. We're also going to have an include an array of stuff and an exclude array of stuff with commas in between them. There we go. That's going to be our three main properties we're going to be looking at here. In terms of exclude, I'm going to exclude our node modules, as well as, if I end up getting to testing, so be it, we're going to have to include something like that to begin excluding any kind of test files, right? So it tells TypeScript basically to ignore files in the node modules directory and any test files ending in spec.ts. I forget how to describe what this glob pattern is, but basically it means like any directory, subdirectory files and things like that that have ending in this extension in particular should be included in the compiling process. Include would be telling TypeScript what to include, which would mean any TS files within the source directory and any of its subdirectories. So this is where we would write, for example, source .ts. We don't have a source directory yet, so let's go ahead and include that right in the root of our project right there. There we go. So anything inside of here ending in .ts should be included in the compiling process. From there, some common properties I like to include, and you can customize this if you already have some TypeScript experience. If not, just kind of follow along with me for now. Our target. The target is going to set the JavaScript version that our TypeScript code will be compiled to. I'm going to choose to do ES 2019, just like the latest and greatest JavaScript stuff. It's a good choice. It's still modern and widely supported without being too far ahead of what's it called? Of what our compiling target might be. Like going too far ahead in deployment, like for example, I know Heroku has like typically older LTS versions of Node. So again, like you want to make sure that you're compiling to something that's still widely supported and not too new and fancy, since your cloud deployments may not be able to handle it. So yep, that's it. For our module, we're going to include CommonJS. CommonJS is a module system used by Node, right? Which is what we're going in, so it should definitely be set to CommonJS. From there, we need to specify where it's going to compile our code out to. I'll say the out directory will be a build folder. And again, if you recognize the build, that's where it's going to compile our source code out into to run our eventual project in deployment. But as you can tell, this is not pushed to GitHub, so this will be something we will simply be telling our TypeScript compiler to build out for us. A root directory, it will set the root directory, like its name implies here, root dir, to our TypeScript files to a folder named source. We're going to go ahead and include that as such. This means when we write TypeScript code in the source directory, it'll be compiled to JavaScript in the build directory, right? Right, so that's our root directory. Then I'm going to include a strict type checking options to strict true. This enables a wide range of type checking behavior that will result in more robust code, meaning there's not a lot of laziness like some of my students in the full stack course will let get away with like :any's and any types and goofy things like that across their project. We're going to just include all of the strict true stuff. And again, we can always tell it to not give us warnings or errors during the dev process, but during like a linting process, we could have very strict rules going on there. From there, we're going to include some module resolution. I'm going to choose to do Node. I need to look into Node next. But anyway, it enables Node.js style module resolution. And considering we're in a Node project, that's what I'm going to include here. And again, because we chose module of common.js, the Node.js way of doing it, we're going to just kind of be consistent there. ES module interop. This enables default imports from modules that don't have a default export, meaning that sometimes you don't know whether you're doing a import curly braces or import thing from thing. If you're not doing a named export or named import and things like that, this just makes it so libraries that we're going to be installing and using that may not follow default export patterns, if they don't use them, this is basically going to be forcing everything to behave in a more consistent way, and it will allow us to not have to constantly write asterisk as imports everywhere. So we're going to choose to do that property right there just to give us some more simple styled imports for across our project. I can't think this is default. Is it true by default? I can't remember. We're going to set that to true. So skip libcheck. It skips type checking for all declaration files like asterisk.d.ts. This is going to just make it so we're not doing type checking against node module declaration files inside of there. We are also going to, this is something that I personally recommend you do, called force consistent casing in file names. I'm going to set that to true. I want to make sure that I'm consistent in my file names. That way, if I'm messing on a Windows versus Mac machine, pushing code and file names to GitHub, I don't want to mess up because I have a Mac laptop. I'll sometimes code on at coffee shops. Your developer trope. I have run into the issue where Git is not recognizing that I changed a file name because I simply changed its casing to be consistent. And if it doesn't recognize that happened, then you're going to have a bad time. From there, I'm going to also, I think that's it actually. I think that's all I really wanted to do for a simple, I don't want to overdo it on the TS config here. And I should say that if someone with a lot more TS experience than me pops in here and has some comments for this or additions that you think I should have in here, please get in the comments below and positively and constructively let all of us collectively know your personal choices. Maybe there's something newer and modern that I have yet to be aware of, but please feel free to share if you want to do so. Now, we still have no way to actually run our project as of yet, so we can make some simple scripts here to get us started. Until I tell y'all otherwise, I guess we'll just have something akin to this, which will be like a start. We should probably have some way of starting our project, so I'll simply say that'll probably be what our build project is. Eventually, I'll switch this from just vanilla Node to something that's a bit more scalable in production called PM2. I like using that for giving myself multiple instances for scaling purposes and things like that, and auto restarts and fun logging and whatnot. But for now, it's just gonna be like, hey, just start the Node project when it's actually compiled. Which, speaking of which, we have no way of building the project as of yet, and we're simply gonna call it as TSC, which will follow the logic we have written within our TS config to actually build out our project. So build script would then make that build folder, compile everything as the app.js, which we haven't even written yet, and then npm run start would then start the project by simply running node on that file. But in development, we're going to be running a separate command entirety, and this is where it's going to get a little bit fun here. So I need to run ts-node-dev, which will be, like I said, that development dependency we installed to quickly allow us to develop a TypeScript Node project without having to compile and run nodemon on things and get all goofy here. So we're going to be using that. I'll be passing it the flag respawn. It will restart the server whenever file changes. So without having to add nodemon here, we already have a flag that can quickly restart our server without us having to remember to go and stop and restart every single time we save our code. A huge quality of life that will be nice for us. Here's I'm going to pass and ignore, I think it's watch flag from my notes. Let's say node modules. It ensures that it won't try and restart our server when files in our node modules directory change. We don't want it to do that, so we're going to say ignore watching the node modules directory. So if something inside of there changes, it shouldn't automatically restart our server. I don't think the order is important, but this is what it is in my notes, so I'll go ahead and do the same way, where I'm going to pass a flag called transpile only. So what this will do is it's going to transpile our files, but not perform any kind of type checks. This allows it, which makes rebuilding a project much, much faster, but it does mean that we're not receiving, again, the point of TypeScript, which would be type checking. So this will make it so it's not recompiling and bundling all of our, not bundling, but recompiling all of our code every single time. So we'll get a lot faster rebuilds and restarts in development. But before we push to production, we probably need to have some kind of command at some point to actually run all of our type checking, which I'm going to be doing via a linting script, where I'll have a, hey, I've written all my code, I got it working in development. Before I push it to GitHub, I'm going to run an npm run lint that should run some common TypeScript rules I'm going to set up to make sure that it can successfully compile my project without tons of errors here. So yeah, that's how we're gonna get started now. And I actually need to tell it one more thing, which would be where we're gonna run our project from. So it'll be the source app.ts file. That's where gonna be the bulk of our coding is going to begin. So I think we're just about ready to actually start writing some code to see if it all worked or if it all comes crashing down on my head. We are done inside the package JSON to my knowledge for now. Again, we'll come add like lint and prettyify scripts later, but for now, let's actually go and write some code here. So let's see. I mentioned it'll be an app.ts. Let's see if this import statement works or not. Okay, I got no red underlined so far, which is a good sign that we have some stuff going on. Let's code the simplest possible server here, which will be invoking the Express function from the default export from Express, which creates a full HTTP application. The app should have a, okay, because I'm getting some IntelliSense autocompletes, we're on a good roll here. On 3000, let's give ourselves a message that says, server, I can't see, running on port 3000. So this is our simplest possible server. I'm also going to include a quick endpoint to test on so we can open Postman and take a look at it. It'll be that right there. res.json. So it'll be a GET request on localhost /please, localhost 3000 /please, and the response should be work, which would be a good indicator that this is all up and running here without too much trouble. So I'm going to open Postman, and I'll have to probably zoom in. Yeah. Oh, it's already fairly zoomed in. Okay, cool. So, yeah. I'm going to make a new collection for this YouTube series, and we're going to call it... There we go. New collection will be called Express Backbone. We'll call it YouTube Express Backbone, so I know it's from a YouTube series and not something like if I look at this in like a month or two and wonder what is that supposed to be right there. So I'm going to close out some of these other files here because we don't need them. All right, so YouTube Express Backbone. We're going to add our first subfolder, which will be... Oh, we don't need it. I'm going to add a request under it. I'm not going to save this. There we go, LOL test. This needs to be localhost 3000 /please was that request. Now, if I hit send, nothing should happen, which would be a good thing because the server is currently not running, so we could not send request because the connection was refused on localhost 3000. So if everything went correctly, we're going to be able to run npm run dev in this project. Yeah, there we go. We got our TS node version. Our TS node is now running our server, watching for changes, which means we should be able to now click send, and we got work as our response, which means we are on our first baby steps after about 35-ish minutes of getting a blank directory, of explaining the purpose of this course, some of the things you're going to need to know and have for this course, and going from a blank directory to talking about some of the most basic develop environment setup to get this up and running here. And again, if I add a bunch of exclamation points and I save the file, TS node dev should have restarted it automatically by detecting changes, which means I can click send and see that response without having to do any kind of complicated work. So this is a simple server, and it's going to get more and more robust and scalable as time goes on. Typically, if you're including testing, it's a very good idea to wrap things inside of functions as a, well, I mean, yeah, I had to rethink. I did a quick edit there because I had to rethink my inks and explanation. But, you know, for small to medium-sized projects, this is completely fine code to write. As you can see, it starts the server, no problem whatsoever. As we can begin to add things to it, we're not going to run into any kind of issues, right? So having all this code not wrapped in a function that we have to call, I mean, it's straightforward. It's simple. There's less boilerplate. There's less crap in the way for us to actually get a server up and running without too much work, right? I will say, because I want to eventually include testing and to make this scalable and robust and feel more professional, we are actually going to make the decision to, instead of writing code as such, to instead writing typically functions, and this may not always be the case, but typically I'm going to be writing functions such as this that I'll have to remember to invoke. Now, in the context of starting up and tearing down a server, this process of wrapping code in a function is really useful in a testing context. I can test if a function starts a server, for example, with a port of a certain thing. I can see if this function does something in a testing context, right? Tearing it down for each test to ensure a clean state. It can provide better error handling if our code inside the function throws an error. So I'm going to choose to, in this project series, to not just write my code, but try and remember to wrap it in a server or a function I'll be calling in the long run. So for now, I'm going to take all that lovely code and paste it in our start server function and confirm that after all that auto-saving, she's still up and running with no problems whatsoever. Now, to add some typical things here before I end this video, I like to do the following. We've created our Express app. We have this dumb checkpoint here. I'm going to call this a health check endpoint, because eventually in between here I'll have a ton of API endpoints, whether they are for authentication or retrieving resources on our API. But I'm going to have a one highest possible level health check for our server that I can hit. This has helped me in the past do confirm that my server is up and running, and the internal server error I'm getting, or 404 error I'm getting, or like, hey, if my friend's like, or my project's not working, I can go check a health status point on my server at the top level to make sure it's, well, up and running, and something further down the line is actually failing. So this gives me a quick indication of the server being up or down, and where the error might end up being in the long run. So in this case, I'll simply send a status code on my health check of 200 OK should that be the case. So first things first, I'm going to change this from lol test to health check as an endpoint, and we'll be /health check. And if that returns OK, we're good to go. So I'm going to make a new folder here in Postman, add folder. We're going to call it server health or something like that, and I'll move that get request into the server health folder. So yeah, we're going to save that, and we are good to go. Something else I'm going to choose to do as well. I already have tons of development variables set. Oh, I don't have one set here, do I? Well, I think I do. Hold on. Yeah, I do have them here. Yeah, so I have various variables, so that'll be that icon next to development right there, set for testing purposes. You can see I do a lot of personal development with these things right here. For development, I'm also going to include some new variables. I'm going to add one here as well. We're going to add it and call it YouTube Express URL. That way I know what it's called. You can call yours base express URL or something like that. That is my variable right there. I'm going to have it have a value of http://localhost:3000. That way I can have this pre-written in all of my requests without having to write it constantly as a base URL. So I'm going to save that as a variable, which means I can now go to my health check endpoint and replace the localhost 3000 part with a double at the beginning, double curly braces, and I can do U2 Express URL. That way, if I happen to change the port in the future or in production, we want to also have a different address, we can do so. So that should be the same request, which I can now save. But now we have a variable that will represent that base URL. That way we can change it easily without having to worry about changing all of our requests, right? So instead of having to go to every single Postman tab, all we have to do is change a variable now that represents that value. So again, it's just a variable. It represents localhost colon 3000, gives us much easier time in the future editing our collection of Postman checks here. So yeah, the final thing I want to do for my server before I end this video, again, I think 40 minutes is long enough for a course video for the first part. I'm going to, in between my health check and things else, if I have some top level error happen, I want to have the following: app use error rec res next. If some high level error happens, I'll talk about why that's being aired out here in a minute, although I find it incredibly annoying that it does that. I'm going to have eventually some kind of logger, but for now I'll have a logger that will simply take my error and log what the error is, or rather since I wrote error instead of error. And I also want to send a status code of 500 and maybe like a JSON response. And I'm going to choose to do error internal server error. There we go. So again, TypeScript Express is not. I installed the types for TypeScript, didn't I? Or Express? I did. Okay, cool. So, it's telling me that it doesn't recognize this as a valid middleware. It doesn't know what these functions are. There's supposed to be an error handling middleware available on Express, and I'm annoyed that the TypeScript typings don't recognize it. So I'm now going to also include the following. Now, if you're wondering, Luke, can I just include these types or use Express dot down here? If I'm importing typings in particular, I like to include the import type syntax to make sure that in the compiled version, they don't have even an accidental footprint in my code. So this will just prevent any kind of compiling of something that doesn't have a JavaScript analog, aka TypeScript types. So I'll say bring in the request object, the response object, and the next function types, and I can now include them down here to say rec, request, response, next function error. I guess could be any, or is there like an error type that way I can just include there? I'll put any for now. We'll deal with that later. But there we go. I just like to have some like top level error handling middleware to say if something went horribly wrong at the very beginning, that this should catch it and then log the error and send a status code telling us that something crashed. Again, if something crashed before we ever got to these steps down here, then it's good to just have that handled right there. From there, we can do the following. Okay, so before I run this app listen, I'm going to do the following. Const server equals app. And from there, I can now daisy chain on my .listen like I had a moment ago. So I will say, again, we're going to default to port 3000, then run the following code. Once again, I'll say server running on port 3000, which will be our message right there, which is no problem whatsoever. But now I can include additional methods, for example, the on method on our server to say, hey, on an error, I want the following to happen. Take the error, and let's be consistent. I called it error down there. Let's call it error up here as well. So I'm going to be consistent in this file and call that error, since I called it error, an error down here rather than error. I need to log what that error was, as I'm curious as to what it is. We want a clean and fast exit. I believe the term for this would be crash fast, or like if your app's gonna crash on an error, then have it close out fast and clean, right? If you crash fast, so you can figure out what's happening here. From there, I need to have process on like that. And I can have, so this is for, my node process. So if someone passes int, I believe sigint and sigterm are the two I typically account for. Sigint was the term when someone stops a process via Control-C, and sigterm is like the Grim Reaper not swinging the scythe, but basically someone saying, something has come into this to stop this process. So this is like terminal bash stuff here. So sigint means I've set the thing, and sigterm would be it's received a signal to shut down the process. So we're going to have two of these, one for sigint and one for sigterm like that. I'm going to do a quick little alt shortcut right here to have a function for both of those like that, because they're going to have similar looking code where I'll have this one log sigterm signal received closing HTTP server, because we want to know that we are closing our server. I don't know why I capitalized server right there. It doesn't need to be capitalized. But I do want it to also, my server to close and run the following console log, which will eventually be closed. So yeah, the whole point is here, like, I just like to have these things logged on my server so I know that there's a difference between me stopping it manually versus a signal being received to close it. And then I want my server, which is why we, made that variable here from the app being returned, right? That express process to allow us to close that server in scope of this process right here. So close server and have that message be relayed. And now I can just include the same code down in for sigint, which I can say sigint signal received, closing HTTP server closed, so I know when the server shuts down. So yeah, that's just some commands I like to include at the start of my server, and then in between here eventually, dynamically imported here. So eventually I'll have it all being dynamically imported right here as various asynchronous loaders to set up our Express, any kind of cron jobs we might have, scheduled tasks, for example, our rest of our Express server, our API stuff, our auth stuff, our Postgres connection, all that fun stuff will be done via imported loaders. So basically this is like the highest possible level of our server to create it. Add all the middlewares that's going to be added on there, have a top level handler to say if something goes wrong in that process that should catch it and just say something went wrong. Oh boy. This will be a top level health check we could do on our server to see if she's up and running to determine where errors might be occurring. We're going to listen, have our app listen on port 3000, have this on error handler lister so we can log the error going on. And we even have abilities to catch sigterm and sigint signals. Again, something being sent to our computer to stop the server, this one being us hitting Control-C to stop it itself, and just kind of logging that information at some point to use if we need it. So yeah, that's it. That's going to be how this thing looks. And as you can see, it's been restarting this whole time. If I hit Control-C, there is our sigint signal received, closing HTTP server, hit Y, and then it would log our HTTP server closed here. So that was our sigint happening right there. So for our start here, I'm going to add this. We're going to call it git commit ending video part 1, and that'll be what my commits look like. That will be the end of each video. Again, I'll try to have the commit and the repo linked in the description down below. And I guess I'll see you all in the next video where we actually begin coding out some of the parts of our Express server and maybe even getting to Postgres and environment variables and that kind of fun stuff. So see y'all then.